The Prince of Shadows, the kingdom of Noctis knew no dawn. A realm where the sun had long since faded. Its sky was a vast stretch of ink, speckled with dying stars that whispered their last embers into the abyss. The wind carried voices that did not belong to the living, murmuring secrets of things forgotten, things buried. And at the heart of this forsaken kingdom stood the hollow keep, a fortress of black stone and silent corridors, where shadows did not merely fall, but lived. It was in this place, beneath the gaze of a blood moon eclipse, that the prince was born. They named him Kyle. The night he came into the world, the shadows stirred restlessly, curling around the great throne where his father, Malagar, the dread king, sat in quiet triumph. The dark recognized the child as its heir, its vessel, its future. And so, Noctis rejoiced in silence. But Kale did not cry. This troubled the midwives, the seers, even the whispering spectres who lurked beyond the veil of sight. A newborn should wail, should struggle, should greet existence with sound. Yet Kyle simply opened his eyes as dark as the void itself, and gazed at the world as though he already understood what it was. A prophecy had been spoken long before his birth, carved into the very foundations of Noctis. From the hollow keep shall rise the Prince of Shadows, whose will shall bind the abyss, and whose throne shall never fall to light. Malagar never doubted the prophecy. He had raised Kale to be as unshakable as the dark itself, teaching him the ways of shadow weaving, the art of command, the weight of dominion. He was a strict father, a merciless king. To him, light was weakness, an affliction that lesser worlds clung to in their ignorance. "Understand this, my son," he told Kyle once, standing atop the highest spire of the hollow keep, gazing into the endless void. "We are the keepers of the dark. We do not seek the light, nor do we need it. The world beyond Noctis is illusion. Only shadow endures." Kale listened. He nodded. He obeyed. But deep within, beneath the layers of duty and obedience, something in him stirred, something unspoken, something unknown. A whisper that did not belong to the abyss, a longing for something beyond the darkness. The hollow keep was an empire of silence. Even the echoes of footsteps faded faster than they should, swallowed by the ever-hungry gloom. Kale walked its halls often, not out of duty, but because stillness unnerved him. The weight of Noctis pressed on his shoulders. A kingdom of unseen things watching, waiting. He wandered beyond the throne room, past the library of forbidden tomes, past the cold chambers where the court gathered in wordless council. He walked until he reached a corridor lesser traveled, where the torches flickered dimly, casting feeble light against the walls. A whisper greeted him. Not the kind he had always known, not the murmur of shadows, not the ghosts of his ancestors. This whisper was different, softer, yet older than time itself. It did not claw at his thoughts like the abyss. It called. Kale stopped. The whisper came again. "Do you dream of the light?" He turned swiftly, his pulse quickening. There was no one there. Only the dark. Only the air itself, thick with something he could not name. Light. The word itself felt unnatural in Noctis, yet it pulled at something in him, something buried deep beneath the weight of his fate. He should have dismissed it, should have turned away, should have returned to his father's side, where the expectations of his birthright would smother the foolish thoughts that had begun to bloom in his mind. But Kale did not turn away. Instead, he listened. The days passed, though time in Noctis was a meaningless thing, measured only by the slow cycle of the blood moon above. The whisper did not return, but the seed it planted within Carl remained. His training continued. The court watched him with hollow eyes, awaiting the day he would take the throne. His father observed him with the weight of eternity, ensuring his son's path did not stray. Carl played his role, as he always had, but the unease did not leave him. Then, on the eve of his 17th year, as he stood before the great mirror of obsidian in his chamber, Kyle noticed something he had never seen before. His shadow, always a perfect reflection of himself, was wrong. It trembled, it hesitated, and for the briefest of moments, as the blood moon's light flickered through the high windows, his shadow shrank away, as though afraid. Kale stepped back, heart pounding, though he could not say why. Shadows did not fear. Shadows did not move of their own will. Shadows did not... A whisper, softer than before, barely more than a breath against the fabric of his mind. You do not belong to the dark. Kyle turned, searching, but he was alone. Or so he thought, because at that moment, standing just beyond his reflection in the mirror, barely visible in the obsidian glass, was something watching him, and for the first time in his life, the Prince of Shadows felt fear. The hollow keep did not dream. It was a fortress of silence, a place where the past did not linger in memory, but in shadow, where the dead did not rest, but watched. In its endless corridors and chambers swallowed by darkness, nothing stirred unless it was meant to. And yet, something had changed. Kale felt it in the way the air pressed against his skin, heavier than before, thick with something unseen. He heard it in the way the whispers that once followed him had grown quieter, as though the darkness itself now hesitated to touch him. Most of all, he saw it in his reflection. The obsidian mirror remained where it had always been, an unbroken expanse of black glass, stretching from floor to ceiling, framed in silver filigree woven into the shapes of silent wraiths. But Kyle no longer trusted it. Not after what he had seen. Not after the thing. His shadow, or something that wore its shape, had shrunk away from him. He stood before the mirror now, the blood moon's dim glow filtering through the high windows behind him, casting his silhouette against the polished black. His own eyes, dark as the void, stared back at him. And yet, something was wrong. The reflection did not move in time with him. Kyle inhaled sharply, stepping forward. The mirror remained unchanged, his figure moving as it should. Perhaps he had imagined it. Perhaps. A whisper curled through the air, as faint as breath. Seek the forgotten one. Kyle's breath caught. The voice was not his father's, not the court's, not the shadows that had whispered to him all his life. This voice was older. It came not from the walls, nor the air, but from within the keep itself, as though the great stones had remembered something long buried, something that should not have been remembered at all. Seek the forgotten one. Kyle turned sharply, scanning the chamber. There was nothing, no one. But the whisper did not fade. It lingered, curling through his mind, threading itself into his thoughts, like a strand of silk woven into a web. The forgotten one. The words meant nothing to him. And yet, he knew where to go. The lower halls of the hollow keep had been abandoned for centuries. Even the Dread King himself did not tread there. Kyle walked the descent alone, past the vaults of shadow-bound relics, past the gates that had been sealed with symbols that no longer held meaning to the living. Dust clung to the air, thick with the weight of ages, and the torches that lined the walls burned with cold blue flame, the kind that cast no warmth, only illumination. The whisper guided him. Deeper! He passed chambers where the great lords of Noctis had once ruled, their thrones now empty, their names long forgotten. He walked until the air grew colder, until the walls of the keep seemed less like stone and more like something alive, something waiting. Then, at the end of the last corridor, he found it. A door. It was unlike the others in the keep. Massive, wrought from dusk metal, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly, as though still breathing. It bore no keyhole, no handle, only a single inscription, carved deep into its core. Only the air may pass. Kyle hesitated. Somewhere, far above, he knew the hollow keep remained silent. His father did not know he was here. The court did not watch. The shadows did not whisper their warnings. For the first time, Kale felt truly alone. And yet, he did not turn back. The whisper guided him forward, pressing against the edges of his thoughts, filling the space where doubt should have been. His hand touched the door. A low hum resonated through the stone, and the runes flared to life, their dim glow shifting into something golden, something ancient, something that did not belong to the darkness of Noctis. Then, with a sound like the shattering of silence itself, the door began to open. The chamber beyond was vast. It stretched beyond what should have been possible. Its ceiling lost in darkness. Its walls lined with towering pillars that bore carvings older than the keep itself. A cold wind stirred the dust at Kale's feet, and with it came the whisper, stronger now, no longer hidden. He was not alone. At the center of the chamber, bound in chains of dusk metal, was a figure neither living nor dead. The forgotten one. Kyle stepped forward, his breath shallow. The being before him was cloaked in what could not be called fabric, but something that shifted between form and shadow. something that flickered like the dying remnants of a star. His face was obscured, yet his presence was overwhelming, ancient, powerful, yet broken. Eyes like hollow voids met Kael's. And then for the first time in 1,000 years, the Forgotten One spoke. The light is not lost. The words struck something deep within Kael, something raw, something forbidden. It sleeps beneath the shadow throne. Kael's fingers curled into fists, his heartbeat a steady drum against the silence. He did not know what these words meant, did not know what this being was, but he knew with the certainty of one who had stepped beyond the threshold of fate, that nothing in Noctis would ever be the same again. The Forgotten One did not breathe. The air around him pulsed with an energy Kael had never known. Neither shadow nor mist, but something else entirely. Something alive. The chains of dusk metal that bound the being shimmered with sigils of old power. Runes that belonged to a time before Noctis had become a kingdom of endless night. And the whisper, the one that had led Kael here, had fallen silent. The light is not lost. The words had not merely been spoken. They had unraveled within the chamber, sinking into the very stone, pressing against Kael's skin like the weight of something long buried clawing its way back to the surface. It sleeps beneath the shadow throne. Kael exhaled, his breath unsteady. The shadow throne, the seat of his father, Malagar, the Dread King. It had stood for centuries at the heart of the Hollow Keep, towering over the court of silent lords, wreathed in the eternal darkness of Noctis. Beneath it, nothing should have existed. Noctis had long been severed from the light. His father had ensured it. The dark was their power, their legacy. The idea of anything lingering beneath the throne, of light itself enduring there, was impossible. And yet Kael had seen the whisper's truth. His own shadow had feared him. Something had changed. Something inside him had begun to pull away from the abyss, as though a hidden part of him had always been waiting for this moment. The Forgotten One watched him with hollow eyes, his presence neither threatening nor welcoming. Kael stepped forward, his voice barely more than a breath. "What is beneath the throne?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the ember. Kael frowned. Ember? The last breath of the sun. The light that should not be. A shiver traced down Kael's spine. He had been raised to believe the sun was a myth, a relic of the world before Noctis had embraced the void. He had never seen it, never felt its warmth. The very thought of it was foreign. But the Forgotten One's voice was unyielding. It waits for the one who walks between dark and dawn. Kael's chest tightened. "I am no such thing." The Forgotten One tilted his head, shadows shifting around his form like unraveling smoke. Then he spoke again, and this time his voice was not a whisper, but a declaration. "You will be." Kael did not return to his chambers. He walked the hollow halls of the keep, unseen, unheard. The corridors felt different now, the walls pressing inward as though they sensed what he had learned. The torches flickered erratically, shadows twitching in ways they should not. The dark was watching. The shadow throne loomed at the heart of the keep. It was a monolith of onyx, its surface carved with runes that devoured light, that drank the silence of the room and held it prisoner. The court was absent tonight, the great hall empty, save for the whisper of unseen things shifting beyond the pillars. Kyle's heart pounded as he approached. This was madness. If his father discovered him here, if the Dread King knew, he forced the thought away. The whisper had led him this far. The Forgotten One's words still echoed in his mind. And the ember was real. He reached out, fingers brushing against the cold stone of the throne. Nothing. No tremor of power, no shift in the air. Just silence. Then, a pulse. A deep, slow heartbeat within the stone itself. Kyle inhaled sharply, his skin prickling. This was not shadow magic. This was something else. Something ancient and forbidden. His fingers tightened. He pushed. The stone did not yield, but the heartbeat grew. Thump, thump, thump. A crack splintered through the onyx, thin as a hairline fracture, but unmistakable. Kyle stepped back. His breath caught in his throat. The throne, the very foundation of Noctis' rule, was breaking beneath his touch. The dark around him shuddered, and then the whisper returned. The light is not lost. A fissure split open beneath the throne, a jagged wound in the floor. From its depths, something stirred. A glow, faint, flickering. And for the first time in 1,000 years, light touched the hollow keep. The moment the ember awoke, Noctis screamed. The darkness recoiled, retreating from the glow like a wounded beast. The keep trembled, its great walls groaning as unseen forces surged and clashed. The torches along the hall guttered and died, swallowed by something they could not withstand. Kyle staggered. The light was weak, barely more than a flicker in the abyss. But its presence was wrong in Noctis. He could feel the weight of it pressing against the keep, as though the kingdom itself had begun to break. And then, Kyle. The voice was not a whisper. It was thunder. Kyle's blood turned to ice. His father stood at the far end of the hall, clad in robes darker than the void. His presence a storm of abyssal power. The Dread King's gaze burned into him, cold and terrible. His expression unreadable. The ember flickered in Kyle's hands, trembling, exposed. Malagar stepped forward, his voice low, furious. "What have you done?" Kyle could not answer. His throat had closed, his mind still reeling from the sight of light in the heart of Noctis. The Dread King did not move closer. He did not need to. The very air around him crackled with shadow, the abyss responding to his rage. "You have awakened something that should have remained buried." His voice was quiet, but in it was the promise of ruin. "You have betrayed your birthright." Kyle's grip tightened around the ember. He could feel it thrumming beneath his fingers, fragile yet alive. His shadow trembled at his feet, shrinking, fearful. And for the first time, Kyle understood. It was not he who should fear the dark. It was the dark that feared him. The silence stretched between father and son. The throne broken. The light returned. And the war for Noctis had begun. The silence between them was a blade. Kyle stood in the glow of the ember, its frail light flickering against the darkness that had ruled Noctis for 1,000 years. Across the shattered throne room, his father, Malagar, the Dread King, stood motionless. His presence vast and terrible. Shadows coiled around him, writhing in unrest. Creatures of the abyss, born from the marrow of the hollow keep itself. The dark knew. It felt the fracture in its dominion, the wound carved into the fabric of the realm by a single ember of light. Kyle's grip tightened around it, but the glow wavered, unsteady, like a dying breath in a storm. And then his father spoke. "You have brought ruin upon yourself." His voice was not raised, but it carried the weight of the void, heavy and absolute. The torches along the great hall flickered, then went out entirely. The room darkened, not the kind of darkness Cale had known all his life, but something deeper, hungrier. "Step away from the ember and I will spare you." Kyle's heart pounded, but he did not move. The ember pulsed in his hands, fragile yet unyielding. His father's eyes narrowed. "Do you even know what you hold, boy?" Kyle did not answer. He barely knew what the ember was, only that it should not have existed in Noctis, that it was not of the abyss, that it had been hidden, buried beneath the shadow throne, as though Malagar had once feared it enough to cast it away, to lock it beyond reach, and now it was in Cale's hands. A slow breath escaped his father's lips, as if in disappointment. Then without a word, he raised his hand. The darkness moved. It surged toward Kyle, a tide of shifting shadows, silent and suffocating. He barely had time to react before it consumed him. Falling. Endless, weightless falling. Through something colder than air, darker than thought. The keep, the throne room, his father. Gone. Swallowed by the abyss. No. He was swallowed. The shadows had taken him. They did not tear at his flesh. They did not strike him down. Instead, they coiled around him like chains, slipping beneath his skin, pressing against his bones. They whispered, "You are of the abyss. You belong to us. You cannot escape." The ember in his grasp flickered wildly, as though struggling to survive. Kyle gasped for breath, but there was none. There was only the endless, devouring void. And then within the darkness, he heard his father's voice. "Did you think you could stand against me?" Malagar was not here, but his words were everywhere, woven into the abyss itself. Kyle clenched his teeth, fighting against the unseen chains tightening around him. "You are my son, the Prince of Shadows. You were never meant for light." The shadows pressed closer, cold as death, suffocating. His fingers trembled, the ember slipping. "No." Kyle's grip tightened. I am more than my bloodline. The darkness shuddered. His father's voice turned sharp, edged with fury. Foolish child. Pain lanced through Kyle's body as the abyss itself clawed at him, trying to unmake him. His mind screamed, his limbs felt weightless, dissolving into the void. Then, light. A single pulse. The ember, fragile and dying, flared one final time. Then the abyss shrank away. Kale fell. His body struck solid ground, cold stone beneath his palms. The suffocating grip of the darkness had vanished, its whispers severed. His chest heaved, lungs drinking in the frigid air. He opened his eyes, his vision blurred. He was no longer in the throne room, no longer in Noctis. The chamber around him was impossible. The walls were ancient, covered in inscriptions that shimmered faintly, as though etched with stardust. The ceiling stretched into infinity, and the air smelled of something unfamiliar. Not decay, not cold, something pure. And at the center of it all, embedded within an altar of silver stone, was another ember, not faint, not flickering, blazing. Kale stumbled forward, heart pounding. His own ember, the fragile light in his hands, pulsed in recognition. He understood now. This ember was not the last. The light had never been entirely lost. It had slept beneath the abyss, waiting, hidden away, where the darkness could not destroy it completely. His father had known, and that was why he had feared. Kale reached for the altar, for the ember that burned with the power of something beyond the night. As his fingers brushed its surface, warmth spread through his skin, unlike anything he had ever known. It was not fire, not destruction. It was life. And as the ember's glow engulfed him, the whispers of the abyss screamed. Far above, in the shattered throne room, the Dread King sensed the change. Malagar stood motionless, his gaze turned downward. He did not move, did not speak, but the darkness around him trembled. The ember was no longer weak. It had awakened. The Dread King exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice that was no longer calm, no longer composed, but edged with something dangerously close to fear, he murmured, "You do not know what you have done, my son." The torches in the keep extinguished themselves, and the shadows of Noctis began to break. The hollow keep trembled. A kingdom where night had ruled unchallenged for 1,000 years was now faltering, its darkness fraying like unraveling threads. The air shuddered with the echoes of something long buried awakening. And in the heart of the abyss, Kale rose. The ember's light surged around him, its glow no longer feeble, no longer flickering. It burned. It did not scorch, did not consume. It was not the cruel fire of destruction, but something else, something Noctis had forgotten, something it feared. Kyle stood at the altar, his hands trembling. The second ember, the one he had unearthed from the ruins beneath the keep, pulsed in harmony with the one he already carried. The two lights had fused, becoming a single flame, neither shadow nor sun, but something between. The whispers of the abyss hissed around him. You are not of the light. You are bound to the dark. You cannot change what you are. Kyle exhaled slowly, steadying his pulse. He was afraid, but fear no longer chained him. His whole life, he had been told he belonged to the abyss, that he was the heir to the darkness, a vessel for the eternal night of Noctis. But the ember had shown him something else, that the darkness itself had been lying. It had hidden the truth, buried the light, shackled Noctis in silence because it knew it could be undone. The light is not lost. The words of the Forgotten One echoed in his mind. The time for doubt had passed. Kyle turned his gaze upward, toward the hollow keep far above, toward his father, and then he stepped forward. The throne room was no longer silent. Malagar stood before his broken throne, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression cold and unreadable. The abyss churned around him, tendrils of living shadows slithering across the fractured stone. But the darkness no longer obeyed him as it once had. It trembled, it recoiled, because something was coming, something stronger than fear. The torches along the walls flickered violently, the blue flames struggling against a force unseen. A low sound rumbled through the keep. Not a voice, not a scream, but a heartbeat. Kale's heartbeat. Then a glow, soft at first, then blinding. Malagar's eyes narrowed, and from the far end of the great hall, Kale emerged. The ember's light trailed in his wake, golden and ethereal, casting long shifting shadows that did not belong to the abyss. The moment his foot touched the throne room's shattered floor, the darkness shrank away from him. Not fled, not fought, feared. Kyle did not falter. He stepped forward, each movement quiet, unhurried. The ember's glow danced across his skin, seeping into his very being. Malagar watched him in silence, and then slowly the Dread King descended the steps of the throne, his presence vast and terrible. You believe yourself free? His voice was softer than before, deadlier. You think light will save you. The abyss swirled around him, coiling like a serpent, its form shifting and bending the very air itself. You are my son. You were forged in shadow. The dark does not abandon its own. Karshal stopped a few feet away. He met his father's gaze, and for the first time, he did not bow. Malagar exhaled. Then I will unmake you. He raised his hand. The abyss rushed forward. Shadows tore through the air, a howling storm of blackness, vast and endless. It was not an attack, not a weapon. It was the abyss itself, the force that had swallowed Noctis whole for a millennium. Kale did not move. He did not need to. The moment the darkness struck, the ember flared. Not in defense, not in violence, but in revelation. The abyss halted. It did not consume Kale, did not devour the light as it had devoured everything else. It hesitated, and then, in a single, terrible moment, it fractured. The entire keep shook as the darkness that had ruled Noctis for centuries broke apart. The torches that had never burned with warmth flickered. The pillars that had held the weight of the void cracked. The air itself, once heavy with the whispers of the abyss, became still. The darkness could no longer hold its form, because the abyss had never been invincible. It had only pretended to be. Kyle watched as the void shattered. Light, soft and golden, began to seep through the cracks in the hollow keep, threading its way through the stone like veins of gold. Malaga took a step back, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time, his voice wavered. "What have you done?" Kyle lifted the ember. It pulsed once, twice, and then released. A wave of light erupted, washing through the keep, through the throne room, through the very walls of Noctis itself. Not destruction, not fire, dawn. And outside, beyond the hollow keep, beyond the towers and ruins of the abyss, beyond the blood moon that had hung in the sky for 1,000 years, the darkness broke, and the sun rose. Noctis was silent. Not the silence of shadow, not the silence of fear, but the silence of something new. Kale stood among the ruins of his father's throne, his breath steady, his body aching. The ember in his hands had faded, but it was no longer needed. The light was no longer hidden. It had returned. The shadows of Noctis did not vanish. They stretched long beneath the golden glow of the morning. No longer prisons, but choices. The people of the kingdom, once bound to the abyss, now stood beneath a sky they had never known. Kale lifted his gaze. His father was gone. The darkness that had ruled Noctis for centuries had fallen, not by war, not by bloodshed, but by truth. The darkness had never been absolute. The light had never been lost. And the Prince of Shadows had become the bringer of dawn, bringer of dawn, bringer of dawn, bringer of dawn, bringer of dawn.